They didn't rebuild a barn. They rebuilt a way to stay. Out on the red clay of Cedar Bend, a woman was put up for sale alongside broken fence posts until a quiet man in a mud-stained hat raised his hand at the auction. No one came to buy a ruined soul, but one man was brave enough to open the door. That rescue was only the beginning. Here, every scar tells a story, and silence speaks louder than any word. Where folks didn't rebuild barns, they learned how to stay, side by side, through fire, reckonings, and all the darkness this wild land could hold. The dust hung thick in the air above Cedar Bend that day, the sort that stuck to your skin and worked its way down your throat until you could taste the land in your teeth. Folks gathered along the old fence lines, hats pulled low, boots caked in the dried-up mud of a long, dry summer. There was a barn at the edge of the auction yard, old wood blackened with years, the roof sagging like it had given up halfway through a prayer. Nobody stood too close. Nobody looked inside unless they had to. They were there to buy cattle, some old harness, maybe a wagon if it could be mended. But on the ledger tacked to the post, under miscellaneous holdings, there was a woman's name written out plain as daylight, Mercy Hale. She was chained to a support beam inside, wrists bound in rusty iron that had bitten through the skin a long time ago and left marks that would never truly fade. Her hair was streaked with dust, her dress nothing but rags, her feet bare and cracked. The barn stank of mold and horse manure, but it was Mercy's silence that unsettled everyone more than the smell or the heat. She didn't look up when people wandered past the open door, didn't blink when a child whispered, "Why doesn't she cry?" The men who ran the auction never answered questions like that. The auctioneer just tapped his pencil on the ledger and said, "Comes with the structure." Former owner's stipulation. Most of the folks tried to ignore her. Some whispered behind their hands, stories about curses and madness and punishment. A few laughed, but their laughter trailed off when Mercy turned those hard green eyes on them. There was something unbroken in her, something you didn't expect to find in someone listed for sale with the rest of the old barnwood. A stranger stood near the back, hat pulled low, boots coated in a slick of mud from the last river flood. Amos Reed. They called him quiet, said he was a widower who kept to himself and spoke only when it was necessary. He watched the proceedings with an expression that gave nothing away, hands tucked in the pockets of his coat. He didn't ask what Mercy had done to end up in chains. He didn't ask if she was dangerous or broken or cursed. He just watched. When the bidding started, it moved fast. 70 for the fence posts, 80 for the tools, 100 for the livestock pen. The barn itself, with everything inside, drew a handful of half-hearted offers. Someone called out 200. Another man upped it to 250, and the auctioneer grinned, looking for a fool to go higher. Amos's hand went up. 300. The crowd shifted. The auctioneer looked at him, searching for a sign of madness or intent. "You understand," he said, lowering his voice. "That includes the woman?" Amos nodded once, silent as stone. 350, shouted someone from the far end. 400, Amos said, almost under his breath, but it carried through the stillness of the yard. The auctioneer hesitated. "You sure, Mr. Reed?" Amos nodded again, and the gavel came down like a gunshot. The moment broke. Someone let out a nervous laugh. A child tossed a rock at the side of the barn. Amos paid, signed where he was told, then crossed the yard with the slow certainty of a man who understood the weight of what he'd just done. He stepped inside the barn, sunlight slicing through the gaps in the boards and painting stripes across the dirt floor. He didn't speak. He didn't try to touch the chains. Instead, he uncapped his canteen and set it on the ground near Mercy's feet. She looked at it, then at him, eyes guarded but sharp. The crowd lingered, hungry for a scene. Amos just waited. Eventually, Mercy reached down with trembling hands and drank, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she hadn't tasted clean water in weeks. There was nothing gentle in the way Amos freed her, just a careful, businesslike turning of the key he'd demanded from the auctioneer, a rough shrug of his coat as he draped it across her shoulders, and a nod toward the open door. No words, no questions. Mercy hesitated a heartbeat, then stepped out into the sun, the light so bright it made her squint. The crowd parted for them as if touched by something sacred or cursed, they weren't sure which. No one cheered, no one jeered, only the wind moving through the grass, the far-off whistle of a train, and the sound of Amos's boots striking the hard-packed earth as he walked away, Mercy at his side. He didn't look back. He didn't have to. The chains lay on the barn floor, catching the afternoon sun, and Mercy Hale followed Amos Reed out of the yard into a world that had never meant to spare her. It was a long walk back to Amos Reed's place, a quiet stretch of land tucked beneath the ridge where the cottonwoods gathered close, keeping secrets in the wind. The trail wound uphill, dust rising in little clouds beneath their boots. The late-day sun bleeding orange through the scrub and the bones of last year's weeds. Mercy followed Amos without question, her bare feet leaving small, uncertain prints behind his steady stride. He didn't offer a hand, didn't speak a word, just glanced back every so often to make sure she hadn't vanished in the rising dusk. When they reached the cabin, he didn't tell her what to do. He simply unlocked the door, pushed it open, and stepped aside. She paused on the stoop, breathing in the unfamiliar scent of home. Old pine, tobacco, burnt coffee, the sharpness of saddle soap. Amos moved inside and set his battered hat on the table, leaving her space to decide if she would follow. She did, silent, pausing just inside the threshold. The place was simple. One room, a bed tucked against the far wall, a stone hearth with the remains of a morning fire, a battered tin pot, a table cluttered with tools and scraps of paper. No woman's touch, not anymore. Amos poured a little water into a chipped enamel basin and set it on the table, leaving a clean rag folded beside it. He didn't watch her wash the blood and dirt from her wrists, just went out to tend his horse. Mercy's hand shook as she peeled away the crusted grime, the pain sharp, the water turning pink and then red, before she wiped her arms clean and put the rag aside. Outside, the evening settled heavy. Amos fed the horse, checked the fences, came back to find the porch swept, the fire restoked, a mug set out for coffee. Mercy moved quietly, almost invisible, but the space began to shift around her. Each small act a signal. She was not waiting to be ordered. She belonged nowhere, but she would not be useless. That first night they ate in silence. Amos offered her bread, beans, a piece of dried meat. She took only enough to fill her hand, chewing slow, her eyes darting to the corners, measuring every shadow. The cabin felt too small for all that hadn't been said. When he finished, Amos went to the hearth and crouched, stirring the embers back to life, the light flickering gold across the floorboards. Mercy sat near the warmth, arms wrapped around her knees, staring into the flames as if searching for a world she'd lost. Her breathing was slow, deliberate, like she was trying not to take up more space than the silence would allow. Amos sat a short distance away, his boots crossed, shoulders hunched, hands resting on his knees. He watched the fire, not her. On the third night, after Amos had put out the lamp and the only sound left was the wind scraping the window, Mercy's voice broke the stillness, low and raw. "Jeb?" Just that. The name hung between them, unfinished. Amos didn't answer. He didn't need to. He let the fire snap and settle, then reached for his battered tin mug and poured a little coffee, setting it down on the table closest to her, but not pushing it into her hands. The gesture was small, wordless, a man giving what he had. The light flickered on Mercy's face, casting her scars into relief. Outside, the quail called from the thickets. The ridge stretched black against the sky. Somewhere beyond the lamplight, the world rolled on, uncaring. But in that small room, the hush felt almost holy. Two lives, each battered in their own way, finding a kind of shelter in not asking, not answering, just staying. It was just past dawn when Mercy disappeared from the porch. The sky was barely silver, dew still clinging to the grass, the cold biting sharper than it had the night before. Amos noticed first when he came out to fetch water. The broom she'd used was propped neat against the door, but her small pile of belongings, a threadbare blanket, the battered comb, was left untouched. There were no footprints in the mud, just the faintest trail through the tall weeds leading toward the stand of pines beyond the horse paddock. He didn't call out for her. He saddled his horse with slow, careful hands, rode the edge of the property, and kept his eyes on the ground. It wasn't hard to find her, even with the world still muffled by mist. A spot of crimson where the sharp stones cut her heel. A thread from her skirt snagged on barbed wire. Then, further on, the low, aching sound of someone breathing through tears. She was kneeling in the brush beneath the oldest pine, clutching something close to her chest. Amos dismounted and approached, not making any more noise than he needed to. He saw the blood on her foot, the trembling in her shoulders, and then the thing she held. A small blackened wooden horse, its sides charred, its head carved with awkward love. He recognized the style. Jeb Hale, her brother, or maybe her son. The town whispered both, never certain. Jeb had used to carve toys just like that, leaving them at the trading post before he vanished 5 years past. Mercy sat back against the trunk, pressing her bleeding foot into the dirt, arms wrapped around the horse. Her face was wet but fierce, as if she'd made a bargain with the pain and wouldn't let go until she got her due. Amos didn't ask questions. He knelt down, took a strip of cloth from his pocket, and wrapped her foot as gently as a man could. He set a canteen beside her knee, just within reach. She didn't thank him, but she didn't flinch either. They stayed that way, side by side, until the sun climbed above the ridge. When they returned to the cabin, Mercy went to the old table outside and with a stick of charcoal began to draw in the dust. Amos stood behind her, watching the story take shape. A trapdoor, flames, a barred window, ham, lua, kua kua. The lines were simple, but they held the tremor of memory, the kind that won't be spoken aloud. Amos didn't ask what had happened, not then. He just wiped the sweat from his brow, left her to her silence, and went to patch the fence that separated his land from everything else. That night, Mercy set the carved horse on the mantel above the fire. She didn't say a word, but Amos saw the initials on the belly of the toy, half burnt but clear, J.H. He understood then. Whatever she'd survived, whoever had tried to burn her away, the memory had stayed with her, carved into wood and bone and breath. Later, after the lamps were turned down and the night pressed in against the glass, Amos found her handkerchief left on the back of the chair. He picked it up, shook the dust free, and folded it with a care that felt almost like reverence. He set it on the windowsill where she'd find it in the morning. The world outside was still the same, wild, rough, unforgiving. But inside that cabin something had shifted, just a little. A story told not in words, but in blood and wood, in silence and small kindnesses. A man with mud on his boots, a woman with too many ghosts, and the sun creeping in, slow but certain, through the cracks in the wall. Cedar Bend was the kind of town where stories traveled faster than horses, faster than a shout on the wind. It didn't take long for word to spread that Amos Reed had brought home the woman from the auction barn. The silent one, the girl folks whispered about, as if she'd dragged the darkness of that place along with her. They said she didn't speak, didn't eat unless you left food where she could reach it, that she'd spent years chained up with the mice and the mold, and still she'd stared back at her buyers like they were the ones up for sale. The town's eyes followed Mercy everywhere, sharp as nails, quick to judge. At the general store, the grocer's wife offered a thin smile but crossed herself behind the counter. In front of the saloon, a pair of old men spat tobacco into the dust and muttered about curses and the ways a soul could rot from the inside out. Children dared each other to run past the Reed place, always in groups, never alone. Some called her the mute witch, others said she was a wild animal, no different from the half-starved coyotes that haunted the hills at dusk. Amos bore it all in stride. He had the look of a man who'd carried worse burdens, who'd long ago stopped worrying about the weight of other people's eyes. But even he noticed the silence that fell when he walked into the livery for supplies, the way hands tightened on bridle straps, the careful sidelong glances cast in his direction. He didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He bought what he needed, said, "Thank you kindly," and left before anyone could work up the nerve to say more. It was the sheriff, Red Holt, who finally knocked on the Reed cabin door one gray morning. His badge was tarnished, his gun belt worn from too many years of worry. He was a tall man, eyes tired but steady, and he stood with one hand on his holster, the other at his side. "Morning, Amos," he said, voice even, almost gentle. "Folks are asking questions." Amos opened the door a little wider, said nothing. The sheriff took off his hat, wiped the sweat from his brow. "Yeah, I heard you bought more than a barn at Pike's auction. You know what folks are saying?" Amos shrugged. "They said the same when my wife got sick. Words blow around here like dust." Sheriff Holt nodded, glancing past Amos into the dim interior of the cabin. He spotted Mercy seated by the window, hands wrapped around a mug, eyes never leaving the far horizon. "I remember the Hales," the sheriff said quietly. "Place burned up 3-4 years back. Tragedy. They said young Jeb was locked in the root cellar when the fire took him. Never found his body, just a scrap of his shirt and a half-melted horseshoe." Amos didn't answer. He just shifted his weight, waiting. People talk about gold under that land, enough to make men forget who they are. I'd hate to see you tangled up in old curses, Amos, or to see her blamed for things she didn't start. Mercy turned slightly, meeting the sheriff's gaze, her face unreadable. Slowly she reached into the folds of her dress and drew out a small, charred medallion. A locket scorched at the edges, its chain broken. She handed it to Amos, who opened it for the sheriff to see. Inside was a faded picture of a boy, Jeb, no doubt, and a slip of paper, burnt but legible. "If Mercy lives, protect her. Jeb H." The sheriff stared at the note for a long moment, then closed the locket and handed it back, his hand trembling just so. "You be careful," he said, voice gruff. "There's men in this town who'd do anything for a handful of gold, and there's stories that ought to stay buried." Amos nodded once, shutting the door behind the sheriff as he left. Mercy's fingers lingered on the locket, tracing the burn marks, her eyes far away. Later, Amos slid the paper into a little leather pouch and tucked it beneath a loose floorboard in the pantry. No words passed between them, but the meaning hung thick in the air. Outside, the world went on, wagons rattling, gossip swirling, the wind stirring up the dust. But in the small hush of the cabin, Mercy sat by the window, watching shadows stretch across the land that had never learned to be kind. Sunday morning in Cedar Bend carried the hush of waiting rain and the creak of wagon wheels over old stones. The church at the end of the street stood plain and honest, white paint peeling from the boards, its bell cracked and sweet and a little sad. Folks gathered early that week, drawn not just by the call to prayer, but by the whisper that Amos Reed's silent woman would be there, sitting among them, not hidden in the shadows of his cabin. Mercy sat in the back row, hands folded in her lap, back straight as fence rail. Her hair was braided neat, scars on her wrists hidden beneath the sleeves of an old shirt Amos had left out for her that morning. He sat beside her, quiet, head bowed, letting the world think what it would. Reverend Ezra Collins, gray-bearded and thin as a crow, delivered his sermon with hands that shook, eyes wandering again and again to Mercy as if searching for an answer in her stillness. People stole glances, murmured behind hymnals. Some shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with what they could not explain. Others felt something like pity or fear or a bitterness they couldn't name. By the time the last song faded, the church was thick with a silence more heavy than prayer. When the service ended, the Reverend's wife, soft-voiced and wrung out by sorrow, crossed the aisle to Mercy. Her own hands trembled as she pressed a faded handkerchief into Mercy's palm. "I remember you," she whispered. "I heard you calling that night. I should have listened harder." Mercy looked down at the handkerchief, then back at the woman. She said nothing, but her eyes filled with the kind of gratitude that can't be spoken. Amos watched from the doorway, hat in hand, heart pounding with an anger he didn't dare show. Reverend Collins approached, drawing a breath as if steeling himself for confession. "Mercy," he said, voice barely above a whisper, "is there something you need to tell this town?" Mercy stood slowly, the congregation turning to watch her, eyes wide and expectant. She stepped forward, each footfall steady on the worn wooden floor. The sunlight through the stained glass painted red and gold across her face. She looked at the faces around her. Old men with bent backs, young mothers clutching their children, the sheriff himself, leaning against the wall, arms folded tight. She didn't beg, she named. "Edwin Pike, Wade Dorner, Arlen Tate," she said, voice steady and clear as creek water after a storm. "They came for what wasn't theirs. They left me chained and my brother dead. That's all I have to say." The words rang out, simple and sharp. The congregation froze, caught between the comfort of pretending and the cold truth now laid bare. Sheriff Red Holt's face darkened. He slipped out before anyone could question him, leaving only the echo of boots on pine floor and a door swinging in the breeze. No one clapped, no one moved. The bell in the tower let out a single, cracked note, then fell, silent. Mercy stood there, shoulders straight, head high, the Reverend's wife weeping softly in the corner. Later, as Amos led Mercy out into the sunlight, he caught the eye of the preacher. There was a question there about right and wrong, about what a town owed to the living and the dead. Amos had no answer to give, so he just tipped his hat and kept walking. Back at the cabin, Mercy placed the handkerchief, now damp with her own tears, beside the locket on the windowsill. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, a promise of rain. Inside, the air was thick with a kind of peace, thin and fragile, as if the world itself was holding its breath. That night, Cedar Bend seemed to breathe with something mean and restless, as if the wind itself carried warnings through the aspen and cottonwood. The cabin windows rattled, lantern light flickering across the walls, shadows darting like old memories. Amos checked the door twice, then 3 times, his thumb brushing the smooth wood of the rifle he'd taken down from its resting place above the hearth. He set it within easy reach beside his chair, close but not threatening, a line drawn in the dust between danger and defiance. Mercy moved through the house like a ghost, her steps so light she left no mark, her face drawn but unafraid. She swept the ashes from the fire, straightened the blankets on the cot, poured water into the tin cup, and set it on the table. Each gesture was a message. I am here. I am not gone. I am not afraid. It was past midnight when the first warning arrived. A stone smashed through the window, scattering glass across the floor, landing just inches from where Mercy sat. She did not flinch. Amos was up in a moment, crossing to her side, rifle in hand, eyes cold and sharp as the night outside. Pinned to the porch beam with a hunting knife was a slip of paper, words written in a hurried, jagged hand. "Send her back or we'll finish what you couldn't." The ink had run in the damp air, but the threat was clear as gunfire. Before Amos could answer, a flicker of orange light bloomed at the edge of the yard, the barn, the hay, the lean-to catching fast. Flames danced wild, smoke rising thick and mean into the night sky. Amos burst from the cabin, rifle in one hand, bucket in the other. Mercy followed, grabbing another pail, her bare feet pounding the earth as they dashed to the fire. They fought the blaze together, wordless and determined, beating at the flames with wet sacks, tossing water until their arms ached and their skin stung. By the time the fire died, only a scar remained. Blackened boards, the sharp scent of loss in the air. Mercy stood in the glow of the dying embers, hair tangled and face streaked with soot, breathing hard but unbowed. Amos caught her gaze. In it he saw no fear, only a quiet rage, one that matched his own. Inside, she picked up the carbine rifle from its resting place above the hearth. Her hands didn't tremble. She checked the chamber the way a child checks the lock on her door, then settled cross-legged near the window, watching the dark. Amos sat opposite, both of them listening to the silence for footsteps that never came. Hours crawled by. Then, in the dead hush before dawn, they heard the unmistakable crunch of boots on frost-bitten grass. 3 shadows drifting just outside the fence, torches in their hands, guns slung low. Amos motioned for Mercy to stay back. She ignored him, leveling the carbine, fingers steady on the trigger. A shot rang out. Amos's, sharp and true. One figure crumpled to the ground. The others scattered, their torches tumbling and sputtering in the grass. Silence crashed in, thick as grief. They buried the man who fell at the edge of the property under a willow that wept over the creek. No headstone, no prayer. Just earth and memory, and the hollow knowledge that violence always asks for more. When dawn came, the town was quiet again, as if nothing had happened. Mercy sat by the fire, the rifle cradled in her lap, her eyes red but dry. Amos brewed coffee in the battered tin pot, set a cup in front of her, then sat nearby, letting the warmth settle between them. She wrapped her hands around the cup, but didn't drink. For a long while they watched the flames in silence, listening to the wind that had carried trouble to their door and might yet carry it away. The hills above Cedar Bend held onto secrets, the way old men hold grudges, tight, long, and with no mercy for time. That night the sky over North Bluff flickered orange, not wild, not careless, but steady, a signal lit by hands that wanted to be seen. Amos spotted it first, a line of fire drawn clear against the stars, too far off for accident. He stood in the doorway, coat thrown over his shoulders, eyes narrow. Mercy joined him, her silence now heavy as a question that can't be answered. Word reached them by morning. Sheriff Red Holt had ridden out to the bluff and come back with a prize. The wooden horse carved by Jeb Hale, blackened by flame but whole, set in plain sight on a stone. He carried it into the jailhouse and set it on the table in front of Mercy and Amos, who had been brought in for their own protection, or so the sheriff claimed. The cell bars were cold, the air thick with the scent of old gun oil and damp stone. Amos leaned against the wall, arms crossed, jaw set. Mercy sat on the narrow cot, turning the toy horse over in her hands, reading the carved initials. She didn't speak, but her eyes flickered, tracking memories only she could see. The sheriff paced outside the cell, thumb tapping nervously at his belt. "You two understand what this means?" he said finally, voice low. "Someone's out there who wants to remind you of the past. Maybe it's a warning, maybe just a game. Either way, it's trouble." Amos didn't answer, but the look he gave the sheriff was sharp as barbed wire. That night the rain came down hard, drumming on the tin roof of the jail. Sometime after midnight the door creaked open, and a figure slipped inside, soaked through, face half hidden behind a bandana. Amos tensed, ready to spring, but the stranger lifted his hands, palms open. "I ain't here to hurt you," he whispered. "Name's Caleb Finch. They sent me to warn you." Mercy stood, eyes searching the man's face. Caleb glanced at the wooden horse, his gaze softening. "I know what happened at the Hale place. Wasn't just Pike and Dorner. Sheriff Holt here's been playing both sides for years." The sheriff's face hardened in the lamplight, but he said nothing. Caleb reached into his coat and produced a letter, the paper stained with blood. The initials H.R. scrawled at the bottom. "You want to know who gave the order? It was Holt. Pike paid, Dorner burned, but the sheriff kept it quiet so the gold would stay buried." Mercy's hands shook as she took the letter. She read it once, then set it alight with a match, watching the flames eat away at the truth. The ashes curled up into the night, gone before they could touch the ground. For a while nobody spoke. The rain eased, then stopped. Caleb slipped back into the shadows, his warning left behind like a bruise. Amos stood near Mercy, close enough for warmth, but not for comfort. He watched her watch the fire die in her hands, and when it was over, he just stood there, silent, letting the quiet settle between them. Morning broke gray and hollow. The world outside the jailhouse hadn't changed, but inside, the truth was burned into the boards. Impossible to scrape clean. The sheriff's office smelled of old sweat, cheap whiskey, and the slow rot of secrets. The rain had left everything slick outside, but inside the air was dry and brittle. Brittle as the nerves stretched thin between the four walls. Sheriff Holt sat behind his desk, head bowed, fingers drumming on a folder that held nothing but blank sheets, his records always cleaner than his conscience. Amos and Mercy stood before him, Caleb Finch hunched against the wall, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion and something like shame. The silence was sharp enough to cut. Mercy set the burned scrap of letter on the desk, ash smudging her fingertips. Holt looked up, the lines on his face deepened by the weight he'd carried too long. "You got your say," he murmured, voice nearly lost in the cluttered room. "You think justice is clean out here? I did what I could. Sometimes a man keeps his head down to keep his own bones safe. Sometimes the badge don't weigh near as much as the debts you owe." Caleb's jaw worked, words struggling to break free. "You let Pike and Dorner run this town. You turned away when Jeb burned, when Mercy was chained." The sheriff's fist came down hard on the desk. "Enough. I'm not proud, but it's done. Pike owned half the men in this county. Dorner ran the cattle. Tate started the fire. I bought you time, Mercy. You wouldn't have lived to see daylight if I'd drawn a line too soon." Mercy's eyes never left his, green and unblinking. "You let them try." He didn't answer. He pulled open a drawer, slid a ring of keys across the wood. "You want justice? Here's your shot. I won't stop you. I won't help either." Amos picked up the keys. He didn't thank the sheriff, didn't curse him, just nodded. One hard, final motion. "You best ride out, Red. By sunup, you're gone." Holt's shoulders slumped. He stood, pulled his hat down low, and walked past them out into the night. The badge on his chest dull as tarnished silver. Caleb followed, but at the door he turned. "You sure about this?" Amos didn't reply. He waited until the sheriff's horse faded into the darkness, then locked the office door and slid the bolt home. Inside, Mercy stood over the empty records folder, her breath coming in quiet waves. Amos emptied the rifle, then loaded it again, one round at a time, as if each bullet was a prayer for a future where men chose courage over cowardice. The lantern flickered. Mercy placed the wooden horse in her pocket, then traced her finger along the map nailed to the wall. A map of the valley, the river, the place her family's name once meant something. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the sound of church bells from the far end of town. Inside, there was only silence. Heavy but honest, the kind that grows in the space between wrong and right. They slept little that night. Mercy lay on the cot, staring up at the ceiling, fingers curled around the edge of her own name carved in wood. Amos sat by the door, rifle resting across his lap, watching the dawn come on slow and gray, like hope that wasn't quite ready to trust itself. By morning, Sheriff Holt was gone, leaving Cedar Bend with one less secret and two more people who had nothing left to lose. The road out of Cedar Bend was a wound in the land, a ribbon of dust and red clay trailing toward nowhere. By late afternoon, the sky had the soft, bruised color of forgiveness, and the breeze carried the hush that follows after something breaks for good. Amos led the way, Mercy walking beside him, her step light but her eyes holding the weight of every mile. Caleb Finch drifted behind, half shadow, half memory, a witness who'd spent too long in the in-between. They crossed the creek at Willow Draw, just as the sun caught the water, gold flickering through cottonwood leaves. There, beneath the broken ridge and the wind-bent willow trees, an old storehouse stood empty, boards weathered to gray, the roof patched with whatever hands could find. This was where Amos stopped, setting down his pack, glancing at Mercy for the first sign of doubt. She shook her head, quiet but certain. This was as good a place as any to try and build something again. By dusk, others began to appear. Mara Kincaid, bruised cheek and a baby clutched to her chest, her eyes wild as the coyotes that roamed the riverbank at night. Ada Lynn dragged a battered trunk, one wheel gone, and behind her came two more women Mercy had never seen before, faces gaunt, hope hanging by a thread. No one spoke of the old barn, of the night the flames roared, or the grave under the willow. They just worked. Mercy swept the dirt floor, her arms steady and sure. She found an old board and carved Willow Draw Refuge with a knife so dull it left splinters in her palm. Amos patched a hole in the roof, climbed up with nothing but a hammer and stubbornness, driving nails into wood that had weathered more storms than most men. They set out blankets on straw, strung up lanterns with bits of frayed rope. When the sun vanished, they gathered inside, the baby fussing, Ada passing around a battered loaf of bread, Mara singing a lullaby in a voice as rough as creek gravel. It was then, as the last orange light faded from the sky, that Pike and company came knocking. A rider thundered up the path, dust rising in his wake, a red-sealed paper in his hand, a writ of eviction signed by Edwin Pike himself. He tacked it to the door, his eyes never meeting Mercy's. "You're trespassing," he said. "This land's not yours." Mercy took the paper, read it, then laid it in the fire without a word. The flame leapt, licking the edges, the seal melting into a dark stain on the hearthstone. Nobody cheered, nobody cried. They just watched, silent and fierce. Later, as Amos sat on the porch, the cool night wind stirring the grass, Mercy came to stand beside him. She rested her hand on the new-cut post at the entryway, fingertips tracing the grain, whispering the name she'd carved. "Willow Draw," she said softly, as if naming it could make it real. Amos nodded, watching the moon rise over the water. Inside, the others settled for the night, exhaustion pulling them under. Outside, two battered souls sat in the hush between storms, holding their place in a world that had tried its best to erase them. Somewhere nearby, a nightbird sang its cry, carrying through the valley, proof that even in a country burned to the bone, a little hope could take root. The old gallows in Cedar Bend had weathered more storms than most men. Its wood was dry, gray as bone, the hangman's rope gone, but the memory still hanging in the summer air. Folks crossed the square quick, eyes averted, but that morning Mercy stood beneath its shadow with her back straight and her jaw set, the morning sun throwing sharp lines across her face. Amos was there beside her, boots planted in the dust. The others from Willow Draw gathered near, wary, watchful, waiting. Mercy hammered a page from the barn ledger to the gallows post, her movements slow and certain. She'd copied it from memory onto a piece of clean brown paper. Names, transactions, debts bought and paid, the whole twisted record of Pike and Company's dealings. Next to it, she nailed a second sheet, a public call for Edwin Pike, Wade Dorner, and Arlen Tate to face the town in 7 days. All witnesses welcome. Truth will speak or fire will. Her handwriting was clear and cold as a January dawn. The town watched in silence. Josephine Hart came up the steps with the weight of a cattle baron and a mother's pride, her rifle across her arm. She read the notice and nodded, then scrawled her own name alongside Mercy's, staking her reputation to the cause. The message was as plain as scripture: we are not alone. That night, trouble struck like lightning. While the others slept in the storehouse, a roar rose from the ridge. The barn at Willow Draw burned, flames leaping higher than a church steeple, sparks spinning on the wind. Amos was first outside, shouting for water, but the fire had a hunger of its own. Mercy ran for the stables, but Amos caught her by the shoulders, held her back while the roof collapsed. The horses screamed, and everything they'd built was swallowed by smoke and heat. The fire raged until morning, leaving nothing but blackened bones and the stink of loss. The women stood in the gray dawn, their faces streaked with ash, the baby wailing in Mara's arms. Amos let go of Mercy only when the flames were nothing but memory. He turned away so no one would see the tears in his eyes. Mercy knelt in the ruins, sifting through the char, searching for something, anything that could be saved. Her hands came away empty, her voice no more than a whisper. "I thought it would be enough," she said, the words rising and falling like smoke, "just to tell the truth." No one answered. The town gathered on the edge of the square, watching as Mercy stood and faced them, her shoulders trembling but unbroken. The ashes drifted on the morning wind, settling in hair and on skin, a silent blessing for the stubborn and the lost. Inside the ruins, Mercy found a single nail, blackened but whole, and pressed it into her palm. Outside, Amos built a new fire, his hand steady as the dawn. The gallows loomed above them, the ledger page still fluttering in the breeze, the call to justice nailed fast and unyielding. They did not speak of hope. They did not name what they were building in the wreckage. They just worked side by side as the world turned on, waiting for the reckoning to come. The land near Widow's Knob never forgot a grave or a promise. After the fire, Willow Draw was only a memory and a patch of scorched earth. Mercy and Amos buried what was left of the horses, shoulders aching, hands raw from digging. The others stood in silence, the baby's cries mixing with the crows, the world holding its breath as if even the wind didn't dare disturb this morning. When the last mound was patted smooth, Mercy placed a strand of horsehair on the dirt, then stood back and watched the sky fade from blue to ash. She stayed. That was all anyone could say in the end. She didn't run, didn't hide, didn't curse the town or the men who'd burned her shelter to the ground. Mercy stood in the open, her clothes still smelling of smoke, her hair stiff with soot, and watched the road for whoever might come next. Amos sat nearby, a rifle laid across his knees, his eyes soft and worried. He didn't ask what she was thinking. He just kept the coffee pot filled, kept the fire burning, did what a man does when there are no good words. One morning, as the sun dragged itself over the ridge, Mercy spoke into the cold. I thought I'd won, she said. The words hung heavy in the air. No hope in them, just truth. You did, Amos replied quietly, never taking his eyes from the horizon. That's why they're afraid. She didn't argue. She didn't weep. Instead, she found a sheet of paper, wrote out a second notice in her careful hand, a public hearing beneath the sky where the truth would be named again. If not by law, the page read, then by fire. She tacked it to a sycamore at the edge of the burned field, letting the wind carry the words as far as it could. That night, while the others slept fitful in the windbreak, Mercy sat by the small fire, tracing the lines of her palm. Amos brought her a cup of coffee, wrapped her forgotten handkerchief around the stock of her rifle, just to keep the cold away. He didn't say why, and she didn't ask. It was enough to sit close, breathing in the quiet, the bitter scent of scorched land and strong coffee. Word drifted back from Cedar Bend. Arlen Tate had been seen near the edge of town, watching from the shadows. Someone found a small toy horse carved with Jeb's initials, left in the grass as a warning. Mercy picked it up and slipped it into her coat pocket, her fingers closing around the memory like a promise. She didn't shudder. She didn't run. She chose to stay, not because the land was safe or the world any kinder, but because this time she would not be moved. The air changed then, a hush falling, not of fear, but of waiting. The town had seen fire, and still the woman stood. No prayers, no curses, just a stubborn, quiet staying. Sometimes that's enough to shift the world, if only a little. In the morning, the baby woke first. Then the women. Then Amos, last of all. Mercy poured the coffee, folded the handkerchief, swept the ashes from the fire ring, and watched the sun crawl higher, bold and gold over Widow's Knob. No one spoke of tomorrow. It was enough for now to simply remain. They gathered beneath the sky because no roof could hold what was coming. The square in Cedar Bend filled slow, ranch hands with dust on their boots, mothers with children clutching their skirts, miners who'd once dug for dreams and found only the bitter taste of someone else's gold. The gallows stood quiet. No noose, just the truth nailed to the post, fluttering in the early wind. Mercy wore her plainest dress, hair pulled back, the scars on her wrists no longer hidden. She walked to the center and waited for the noise to settle, her gaze meeting every face that dared to meet hers. Josephine Hart took a seat in the front row, rifle across her lap, nodding once to Amos, who stood near the edge, jaw clenched and eyes stormy. Even Reverend Collins and his wife came, their hands linked, as if prayer might help the words land softer. Mercy didn't give a speech. She opened the ledger page, read aloud the names and numbers, the bribes and debts, the girls listed as livestock. Every word fell like a stone. She told them about the night of fire, the locked cellar, Jeb's carving, the way Pike and Dorner and Tate had come masked and left ruin behind. Her voice didn't shake. She did not beg. She named. Edwin Pike was nowhere to be seen. Wade Dorner hobbled into the crowd, arm in a sling, face pale and tight with pain. Arlen Tate stood behind the back row, coat gone, eyes sharp and sly, a half smile working at the corner of his mouth. He listened, unmoved, until Mercy called his name. Then he stepped forward, loud enough for all to hear. Still telling stories, girl? All these folks looking for a show? Amos started toward him, hands clenched. Mercy put out her arm, stopping him cold. Not this way, she whispered, just for him. Mara Kincaid, the young mother, stood at the edge of the crowd, baby strapped to her chest. Her eyes were red from smoke and loss, her hands shaking. She stepped forward, drew a pistol from beneath her coat, and fired. One shot, clean and sharp. Arlen Tate staggered, looked down, saw the blood blooming in his shirt, and folded into the dust before he could curse her name. The crowd gasped, scattered, then stilled. The baby cried, shrill and unbroken, the sound louder than the shot itself. Mara dropped the gun, her knees giving out, and Josephine was there in a moment, gathering her close. Mercy stood silent, the ledger held tight against her chest. Amos crossed to her side, eyes locked on hers, steady as a hand on a wounded horse. No one cheered, no one wept. Only the wind moved through the gallows ropes, and the sun crept higher, bright and relentless. Reverend Collins removed his hat, bowed his head, and murmured a prayer for the living and the dead. After, when the crowd had thinned, Mercy knelt in the dirt, tracing Jeb's initials on the wooden horse in her pocket. Not vengeance, she whispered, but ending. That night, no one slept easy. The world had shifted, just a little, but enough. For the first time in a long while, Cedar Bend was quiet. Mercy and Amos walked back through the fading light side by side, not needing to say what both now knew. The past could be buried, but the living would remember. Morning broke slow, golden on the river grass, cool air thick with the promise of change. Cedar Bend was quieter than usual. No wagons rattling, no dogs barking, just the hush that follows after something too big to name has passed through a place. Mercy and Amos woke at the edge of what had once been Willow Draw, now only ash and memory. The others still curled in their blankets, chasing what little sleep they could find. It was Josephine Hart who found them. She rode up with the sunrise, dust clinging to her boots, a folded piece of paper in her hand. "You started something here, Mercy," she said, her voice gruff as gravel but kinder than most prayers. "There's 3 acres along Clearwater Creek. Not much, but enough. Nobody left alive with a claim to it but me, and I'd rather see it put to right than left to rot." Mercy took the map, her fingers trembling for the first time in days. She studied the lines, the little creek winding between cottonwoods and pale stones, the flat spot where wildflowers grew thick each spring. Amos put a hand on her shoulder, solid and warm. "It's yours," Josephine said. "Build what you like. Folks'll come, some'll leave. That's the way of things." They worked all day, measuring out corners, marking trees with red twine, driving stakes deep into good earth. Amos built the cabin first, 2 rooms, a stone hearth, a porch wide enough for 3 chairs, and a view of the slow water. The others raised fences, planted beans, fixed a gate with iron nails scavenged from the ruins of Willow Draw. Josephine oversaw it all with a nod and a watchful eye, her men dropping off tools and grain, leaving more than they took. By sundown, a sign hung above the cabin door, carved from salvaged wood, "Willow Draw Shelter and Farmstead." Below it, in Mercy's careful script, another line: "We trade nothing but hope." Word spread. Men and women from every corner of the valley came with offerings. Buckets, blankets, a kettle here, a loaf of bread there. Some stayed to mend a fence, others left with a promise to return. Even Edwin Pike's lawyers couldn't shake Mercy's new hold on the land. The records were too thin, the witnesses too many. For the first time, Mercy belonged to nothing but the sky and the soil beneath her boots. One evening, a letter arrived. No signature, just a rough scrawl. "They're selling again. 3 towns west." Mercy read it once, folded it small, slipped it into her pocket. She didn't say a word, but Amos saw the resolve set in her jaw, the way her fingers closed tight around the map. Later, as dusk settled and the porch lights flickered to life, Amos set a 3rd chair beside the others. He didn't say why, and Mercy didn't ask. The baby Mara carried giggled in the grass. Ada Lynn whittled a toy fox, and Mercy, for a moment, allowed herself to sit in the silence, the cool of the river breeze on her cheek. The map lay open on her knees, the future wide and uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, the ache in her chest felt more like hope than hurt. When night came, she stood on the porch, looking out over the land. The stars seemed closer here, low enough to touch. She breathed in deep, the smell of wood smoke, wild mint, and river stone. The kind of air that forgives. Years passed at the slow, honest pace of the river. The wild grew tame around Willow Draw shelter and farmstead, not by will, but by the steady work of battered hands and hopeful hearts. Morning mist curled off Clearwater Creek, roosters crowed from fence posts, and Mercy woke each day with the memory of fire still faint in her hair, but less in her bones. Girls arrived alone or in twos, some clutching babies, others silent as wind, their stories carried only in the way they flinched at the creak of a door or wept at the smell of baking bread. Mercy met each one with a nod, not a question. She taught them how to mend fences, tend goats, patch shoes, and keep the ledger honest. No one was asked about their scars. Here work came first. Healing, if it came at all, arrived on its own schedule. Amos built new cabins with timber he felled himself. Hands steady, face weathered by sun and wind, he never said much. In the mornings he set 2 mugs of strong coffee on the porch. One for himself, one for Mercy. If she slept late, he left hers to cool, never moving it until she came. At dusk, he'd sit in the 3rd chair, boots propped on the rail, waiting. Sometimes they spoke, mostly they didn't. The quiet meant more than words ever could. Some women stayed, others left, carrying the name Willow Draw with them, starting shelters in distant towns, somewhere west, always west. Sometimes word came back, another barn saved, another auction stopped, another girl given a new name. Mercy kept a ledger of these too, not for pride, but so she would not forget who had passed through, who had found enough hope to try again. One spring, a wagon appeared at the gate. A boy of 15, hair wild and eyes sharp, led a little girl by the hand. He carried a letter, Josephine's writing bold across the page. Found these 2 on the road. Parents gone, figured they might have a shot with you. Mercy studied them, saw the hunger and the fear, the set of the boy's jaw. "You any good with chickens?" she asked. He straightened, defiant. "I can learn," she nodded. "Good answer." She turned to Amos, who watched from the doorway. Smile tucked beneath his mustache. "Think we got room?" Amos tipped his hat. "We always do." They never rebuilt the old barn. The charred beams stayed where they lay, half buried in the grass, a warning and a memory both. The real shelter was not the roof, but the porch at dawn, the coffee mugs, the 3rd chair, the careful kindness that grew from shared silence. News reached them now and then. 3 towns west, another auction, another evil wearing a friendly face. Mercy would pack a bag, oil her boots, gather the older girls, and Amos if he'd come. No banners, no speeches, just work that needed doing. They burned down what needed burning, broke locks, carried the lost home. Sometimes it was enough. On the last day of summer, Mercy sat on the porch with Amos, dusk stretching soft across the field. The air was thick with wild mint and cut hay. Her hand found the old handkerchief she'd once left on the rail. Amos, not looking up, spoke quiet as prayer. "I ain't ever leaving, Mercy?" She didn't answer, not with words. She poured him a mug of coffee, set it beside his, and watched the night settle in around them. Their names unwritten, but their staying certain as the sunrise. The wind carried laughter from the cabins, and for the first time, it sounded like a beginning, not a memory. If this story moved you, even a little, drop a 0 or 1 down in the comments. It lets me know you're still here, listening on the porch with the rest of us. And if you want more true grit tales from the wild side of the West, hit that subscribe button. There's always another story waiting just over the next ridge. See you on the trail, friends.